Hello there and welcome to this instalment of 12 Days of Amiga, ranking the Amigas from worst to best. Well, I hope you enjoyed the last video, and if you haven't seen it already, I would suggest you go and check it out before this one, and you can find it in one of these corners. I'm just not really sure which it is. Anyway, this is a slightly irreverent look at all the Amiga models that were marketed and sold by Commodore and latterly Amiga Technologies. Basically, the criteria for how I've ranked this is explained in that first video, but very briefly, it's my own personal opinion, which is designed to offend you. And but seriously speaking, it's based on what the machines were at the time of launch, where they figured into the marketplace, what had gone before it, and where I think they, figure into having an Amiga these days as a system to use, play games, use apps, whatever you want to do on your Amiga, make music or something on it, make graphics. It's a bit of a melting pot of things, but I do have a serious message to convey, and it has come to my attention through some of the comments that were left on the last video. Well, certainly I've imagined that there were some comments left in the last video, but this is no joking matter, that I had a few letters come in through the post which arrived amazingly in Japan within about a day of the video coming out. And this one comes from B. Astard of Portsmouth. B. Astard writes,
Dear Vicky, thank you very much for your recent video of 12 Days of Amiga. Unfortunately, it's come to my attention that your set is somewhat lacking. Not only do you lack an IKEA black bookshelf straining under the weight of too many video games behind you, it's also come to my attention that your series, so-called alluding to the 12 Days of Christmas, is entirely lacking in any Christmas apparel. I would hope that you can correct this situation forthwith. Yours sincerely, B. Astard.
Well, thank you, B. Astard. I have taken on board your criticism seriously, and I have endeavoured to arrange the delivery of a black IKEA bookshelf to ensure that I can stand out as a YouTube channel. But further to that, I can now confirm that Christmas is no longer cancelled, because I am proud to announce that I have gone all out, and magically the set will transform as I unveil this wonderful, wonderful Christmas display. There we go. I don't think anybody can complain that Christmas is cancelled on the 12 Days of Amiga now. Anyway, without further ado, obviously serious business has to be dealt with. What is today's Amiga? Well, in at number 11 pop pickers is the Amiga 500 Plus. This may stir a few feathers, ruffle a few feathers. You could stir feathers. I mean, you can stir with a feather. I mean, I wouldn't want to stir a cup of tea with a feather, but anyway, let's not get too bogged down into those thoughts. The Amiga 500 Plus. So, what is this machine? Well, it's this. It's an Amiga 500. Well, it's very nearly an Amiga 500. I mean, for intents and purposes, it looks exactly like an Amiga 500. So let me take you back a bit. Let's go way back to the original Amiga when it was launched in 1985. Unfortunately, that machine just wasn't selling well, and to get through Christmas 1985 and into 1986, Commodore was really relying on sales of its older machine, the C64. Now, the original Amiga was later rebadged or relabeled the Amiga 1000, and that of course means that Commodore had launched new models in the Amiga range, and that included the Amiga 2000 and most crucially, the Amiga 500. Now, Commodore may have been many things, but one of the things that they were particularly good at was taking a design and rationalising it and cost reducing it, and the Amiga 500 really represents that. It's a rationalisation of the Amiga 1000 design, putting it into a slightly more compact case that would have been familiar to the European market particularly, but also America and Canada and other countries like Australia and New Zealand to an extent. And well, it looked very much like this, to be honest with you. So, what was the Amiga 500? Well, it was very similar to the original Amiga. It still sported the same 7 MHz or thereabout 68,000 Motorola processor. It had all the Amiga's custom chips that it was famous for, as well as including 512 kilobytes of RAM directly on the motherboard. So That was a doubling of the base memory over the original Amiga 1000. But apart from that, they actually share a lot of similarities. For example, they have the same type of expansion connector, which wasn't featured on any other Amiga model. Well, except for this Amiga 500 Plus. But by the by, it was basically a cost-reduced, slightly more compact, all-in-one unit Amiga 1000. So this went on to sell very well indeed. In fact, it sold in the millions in Europe. And it was, by all accords, a very successful machine. So what does Commodore do? Does it start developing a suitable successor to the Amiga 500, noticing that basically where this is doing really well is actually within the games market? Well, no. What they do instead is that they spend some time fannying about with the Commodore 64, by which time it's about 7 years old, and release a hideous games console based on that design. Essentially, all they did was put a Commodore C64C motherboard into this elongated piece of trash and bundled it with some games, and wondered why in 1990 nobody wanted to buy this C64 games console. But maybe it doesn't matter so much, because the Amiga 500 was really getting into its stride in about 1989-1990 and was becoming incredibly popular. Now, the reason I bring up the C64 GS is that, as anybody knows, the market wasn't standing still. Other things were being released. In 1988, from Sega, the Mega Drive was released, which was then rebadged as the Genesis in the US, and I don't know, was it the Genesis in Canada? Tell me in the comments. Anyway, basically, also in Japan, there were other machines that were very competitive, particularly the PC Engine, a bit of a mythical machine if you weren't Japanese at the time.
Well, actually, I think you'll find that... No.
And I think a few people from maybe Mean Machines like Jazz, Rignall and so forth had the pleasure of being able to use the PC Engine, but for the vast majority of people in Europe, I don't think we even knew that it existed. But these were extremely competent games consoles, essentially, and would give a very strong competition to anything that we had in Europe, really, if you ask me. But of course, obviously, that wouldn't be all that would be coming out. In 1990, Nintendo released the wildly successful successor to its Famicom, or Nintendo Entertainment System, the Super Nintendo, or the Super Famicom. In fact, there's one there, So the market wasn't standing still. So Commodore really should have been producing something to either complement the Amiga 500 and really take the Amiga down a games line in one particular direction, or it should have been thinking about creating a suitable successor in the vein of the Amiga 500. Well, until the 1200 came along, it won't surprise you that they were doing neither, because, as I say, the C64 GS games console came out, or Games GC, Games System, whatever it was called, doesn't really matter, does it? It was crap. So, basically, they were doing neither of these things. And in my opinion, I've always held the belief that what Commodore really should have been doing is they should have realised that this thing's selling like well, not this thing. The Amiga 500 is selling like hotcakes. We should be designing a console-based Amiga. We're going to bless it with at least 2 action buttons, so we don't have to use up for jump. And we're also going to rely on cartridge-based media. Now, some of you may think, well, the Amiga doesn't support, ROMs or, cartridges and so forth for loading games off of. And technically, that is somewhat true, but it could be made to. There is some evidence that that is what Commodore was working towards with their initial designs for the Amiga 300, or what later became the 600. But basically, there is an area of memory that is available to the Amiga 500 that is called the Zorro 2 memory space. And this is essentially 8 megabytes, so that's 64 megabits, so that's bigger than any Super Famicom or Nintendo cartridge ever released, that is accessible to the Amiga 500 or the original Amigas, or in fact any Amiga, and it can, load data essentially from that area. Now, obviously all Amigas have generally used that memory space for RAM, just random access memory, like you switch the machine off or reboot it and it's lost. It's not like ROM like you get in a games console cartridge. But I believe it would have been very possible to essentially convert that space into where it would be mapped to a games cartridge that you plug into the system, and that would have had numerous benefits. You would have been able to load data into the system far quicker than the floppy disk, giving you a much more console-like experience, and it would have improved things such as graphics and so forth, because you would have been able to pull a lot more in on the fly, which you can't really do that easily on a floppy disk based Amiga system. You know, you have to basically load in data slowly over floppy disk and hope that you've got it just in time before it's needed. But if you've got the assets in ROM, or in that memory space that I talk about, you can pull them in, and then when necessary copy them out of RAM into a special area of memory called chip RAM, which the Amiga's special custom chips can access, and it can make use of it. So it would have enhanced things no end, really, and whilst it wouldn't have remained that competitive, you know, for that much longer, if that had come out in, say, 1989 or very early 1990, it may have given the Amiga a good couple of years or so to basically fend off the challenge from the Mega Drive and so forth, and then hopefully Commodore could then have updated it further still with a system with more capable graphics and so forth to then start heading off the challenge from the Super Nintendo. But of course, obviously, none of this happened. So what did happen? Well, Commodore basically kept on selling the Amiga 500 for nearly 5 years, until December of 1991, when stock was beginning to run low of the original Amiga 500, because waiting in the wings, Commodore had this, the Amiga 500 Plus, ready to launch itself upon the world. And, well, what kind of upgrade was it? Well, minor at best. All Commodore really did, on the face of things, is move the 512k memory expansion, which they started bundling with the Amiga 500 around about 1990, onto the actual motherboard itself. So that brought the memory up to 1 megabyte, so the same as the Amiga 500s they were selling literally the month before this landed. And it also put in a self-destruct device, also known as a battery-backed clock. So what is this thing? Well, it allows you to set the date and time on the computer and it will remember it. But the problem is that when these batteries die, they begin to leak acid all over the motherboard, thus destroying the computer, either necessitating expensive repairs or just completely destroying it beyond all reasonable economic repair. And that's what happened to a lot of these machines. In fact, the very Amiga 500 Plus that I had in the 90s had the same fate, but at the time I had no idea that it was the battery that had killed it. Anyway, so apart from that, there aren't any real massively major changes that would affect playing games on this system. And the reason I keep on mentioning games is because, let's face it, most Amiga 500s were used to play games, and this didn't really provide that much benefits. It did also offer two other things over the Amiga 500. First of all, it did at last include Kickstart 2.04, which was the first truly stable version of the Release 2 of the Amiga's operating system. Now, this was the first system to come with it after Commodore launched the Amiga 3000, its flagship model, in June of 1990. So that was a decent upgrade, because I'm of the opinion that Workbench 2, Amiga OS 2, whatever you want to call it, is far, far better than Amiga OS 1.3 and what preceded it. It had a slightly better looking user interface, much more professional looking, at least for a period, and in terms of an OS, it's just much, much better thought out, fleshed out, consistent, and all these kinds of things. So that was definitely a good thing. It also included the ECS chipset. What's ECS? Well, it stands for the Enhanced Amiga Chipset. Well, Enhanced Chipset, at least. Or, as I used to call it when I was little, the Enchanced chipset, which I don't know what that's meant to mean. Maybe it means that it's got a bit of Disney in it or something. You know, like maybe it's got like a magic castle or something like that. Anyway, wherever I'm going with that, let's just let that go over there. Anyway, so... But really, ECS wasn't much of an upgrade. There was one mode that it did include, which was at least the mode that I think all Amigas should have had from the very first one that was launched in 1985. And this was a true square pixel, flicker-free 640 by 480 VGA style screen, which you could plug in a VGA monitor and display this nice, steady picture on. The downside is that you could only display 4 colours on it, and those 4 colours were from a very restricted palette, so not that great. And then also the ECS included some other modes But in particular, one that always seems to get brought up is super high res. Well, what's super high res? Well, it's a completely unusable mode.
Superb.
Again, restricted to 4 colours, with a limited palette at that.
Great.
And essentially it's got stacks of horizontal resolution,
Nice.
but almost no vertical resolution whatsoever.
Really great.
But don't worry, there's an interlace version of it as well to burn your retinas out on your little Futaba fast text TV. Nice. Very nice.
Jingle bells.
Anyway, so really, yes, this is just a mild rehashing of the Amiga 500. But the problem with some of these upgrades, it actually broke compatibility with some Amiga games. In fact, it really didn't break compatibility to that many at all. But this was blown up into a big issue, and unfortunately probably did a bit of a number on this machine. And so, yes, there was lots of complaints from people saying, I don't want an Amiga 500 Plus, I want the original one because I really want to play Treasure Island Dizzy. God knows why. Anyway, so I think the issue was slightly overblown in magazines like Amiga Format, and unfortunately I do think that did actually do some damage. But I think the fact that this was virtually no better than the Amiga 500 that came out 5 years before it really was the main culprit of this, because the Mega Drive was really beginning to fly by this point in the UK. The Master System was still doing great in the UK, and in the rest of Europe these machines were really getting a foothold as well. I mean, 6 months before this, Sonic had been released, and whilst we can argue that the original Sonic game is not the best game, at the time it was hot property, and it was very clear by this stage that it was not going to be coming out on the Amiga. Not that that was a bad thing, because I think originally it was US Gold and their Destroyers-in-Chief tier text that were going to be tasked with porting that, so yeah, I can just only imagine a Sonic port by tier text.
Shite.
Anyway, enough of that disturbing thought. So, yeah, the Mega Drive was doing great by this point. Electronics Arts was very much, realising that, hey, the Mega Drive is what we wanted after all. It's essentially a cheaper Amiga, inverted commas, which allows us to port many games to it and start developing for it. Hence why you saw so many Electronic Arts games on the system which had originally come over from the Amiga, like The Immortal, Desert Strike. I've already run out of games, but you know what I mean. There was a lot of Electronic Arts stuff on the Mega Drive. And then, of course, in Europe at least, 4 months after the Amiga 500 Plus was released, the Super Nintendo came out, which had already been launched in Japan about a year and a half, or no, about a year before I think it was, and had been launched about at the same time in the US. So this really wasn't going to fly against either of those two consoles. You know, when you've got games like Super Mario World, Sonic on the stage, you've got F-Zero, you've got Pilot Wings, you've got Gradius 3, even though it did suffer from some slowdown. You've got games like ActRaiser. I mean, that's the Super Nintendo. On the Genesis or the Mega Drive, you've got things like Sonic the Hedgehog, as I say. Forgotten that. Oh, you've got Strider and all this kind of great stuff on that system. You know, this really starts to look quite dated. And yeah, I think the writing was pretty much on the wall by when this came out, really. I mean, I remember when I was at school, I would still hear lots of kids in the playground saying, oh, I've got an Amiga 500, and this would be around about 1991, 92 or so. I mean, I didn't myself, but, you know, it was still talked about very fondly, but it was very clear that most people were, getting geared up to move on to a console of some description. You know, some unlucky people would have got a C66.
Tell me, well, actually, I think you're fine, but no.
I mean, some people have been unlucky and got a C64 GS. Poor sods. But most people were getting a Mega Drive or a Super Nintendo. So yeah. So why do I think that this is not a particularly great Amiga now? Well, really, it comes down to that battery backed up clock. Because most of them are doing a number on these systems, so a lot of them that have been stored away for years and then are now dead. Some of them are completely beyond economical repair, and therefore this is just a bit of a pain in the bum as machines go, to be honest with you, in this day and age. It does do mildly better than the Amiga 1500 insofar as that, some cheap upgrades are available for this machine, which allow you to upgrade the RAM. And, you can put in compact flash cards on some of these updates, and some of them include faster processors. So, yeah, it's not too bad. But these are quite big machines as well, and if you want something compact just to do a bit of gaming on and do a bit of Optimed or Pro Tracker or D-Paint on, these are not the most, compact systems to have, to be honest with you, in this day and age. And I just feel that, for what this offers over an Amiga 500, I just really don't think that this is particularly worth it. There is one small area where this does have an advantage insofar as that these can take up to 2 megabytes of chip RAM, which if you're doing animation and so forth on an Amiga in Deluxe Paint or Brilliance or whatever, that does give you some material advantage over, say, choosing an Amiga 500. Those machines can be taken to 2 megabytes of chip RAM, but it's just a little bit more involved, requiring specific expansions, which are becoming more expensive by the day. But I think there are other Amigas out there, which I will eventually get into, that will give you the 2 mega chip RAM and for a lot less money and with a great deal more reliability. So yeah, the Amiga 500 Plus, a complete mess up of a system. This was replaced 6 months after it was introduced into the market by its successor, which we'll talk about at some point in this countdown. But yeah, what do you think of the Amiga 500 Plus? Best Amiga ever launched? Fond memories of the Cartoon Classics pack, maybe? I'm not sure why. I mean, yes, it had D-Paint Free, and it had Lemmings, which was awesome, but it also had Captain Planet and Bart Simpson versus the Space Mutants. Anyway, or maybe you agree with me. Let me know what you think down in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed this look back at ranking the Amigas, 12 days of Amigas. And yes, in at number 11 was the Commodore Amiga 500 Plus. Anyway, that's all I've got to say about this one. I hope you're keeping well. And yes, if you've got any comments about my Christmas decorations as well, please be sure to send those to the usual address. Anyway, thanks for listening. And I guess all remains for me to say is see you soon. Peace.